Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Kale Zelden podcast. I'm here with my good friend now, Larry Chapp, yes, and Larry, welcome back. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you. I
I
love
hope you
doing
had
this
a.
podcast with you.
Oh yeah, they're fun. They're fun. They're really fun. I hope you had a good Easter. I know ours was lovely, actually, and it's sort of we're deep into the throes of the season now, so it's nice.
Oh yeah, my 3.5 hour long ordinary
Uh,
liturgy for the Easter
I'm
Vigil. It was gorgeous, but taxing on my. Well, it was taxing. Let's put it that.
Well, I must say I'm jealous. I'm jealous. So, but ours was fine. Ours was fine. I'll take what I got. But anyway, maybe we can talk more about the whole liturgy phenomena later on. I think we'll touch on it a little bit today. But
Yeah.
I wanted to start today's show. This is our third time sitting down and talking. It's sort of we did a first piece on on part one of the numbing down of the church. We have recorded a second show which sort of encompasses part two and part three,
Right.
and now here we are at part four, which is entitled "The Universal Call to Holiness and the Semi-Donatist Option," sort of. And really looking forward to diving into this. And before I let you talk, because really that's the point of this, I have to say I've been a fan of this kind of work, not so much because I've been satisfied with this kind of work, this sort of analysis of where we stand, but I'm really deeply appreciate your work here, Larry, because I finally found an analysis that I find both fair, it is insightful, and I think it is different insofar as focuses us it focuses our attention, I think, on the important thing, which is this bomb that you reference. So at the end of part three, you say that it's not so much that Vatican II was radical, but that it wasn't radical enough. And maybe that's a good place for us to start in this debrief on part four.
Sure. I think that what I meant by that, I was alluding to the fact, going all the way back to one of the co-founders of the Catholic Worker Movement, Peter Morin, who always said that his project was that he wanted to explode the dynamite of the church. And he was very Orthodox, of course, and a very devout Catholic. And so what he meant by that wasn't some kind of grand sort of modernist revolution in the church. He meant
Mm-hmm.
the church has the internal resources, if it would but use them,
Mm-hmm.
to really explode our culture and explode our categories. And that's what he wanted to do. And to that extent, this is what I mean where I don't think Vatican II was radical enough, because it had the seeds of that dynamite. It's got, well, not just the seeds of the dynamite, it has the
As the
dynamite.
dynamite.
But it sort of stopped short of exploding that dynamite, in my view. Others disagree with me, but I think that it did. Here, for example, in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, the council emphasizes the universal call to holiness, which is not a new doctrine, of course. It's a very
Sure,
old doctrine.
of course.
But what was unique about Vatican II was that it put the universal call to holiness right smack in the center of that document, chapter 5. Okay? And it sort of, therefore, is the fulcrum upon which the whole thing turns. It's discussion of the hierarchy, it's discussion of the laity, it's discussion of the episcopal structure of the church and all that. Right in the middle is this universal call to holiness, which is like this ticking time bomb that should have just exploded and said, yes. All right. But it just sort of leaves it there then.
Mm-hmm.
It just sort of
Mm-hmm.
lands with a thud and says, okay, but it doesn't give a great deal of specific content to what it meant by the universal call to holiness. And I
Okay.
outline some of what I thought was lacking uh, in my blog post, where I talk about, political liberalism, the culture of modernity, bourgeois comfort, and all that. That,
Yeah.
the council condemns militarism, it condemns consumerism, it condemns the excesses of capitalism, and so on. But these are almost sort of pro forma statements,
Mm-hmm.
anodyne statements. There's not a lot of pugilistic punch to it that then gets hooked up with the universal call to holiness and says to the laity and to the clergy, and here's what we need to be doing.
Yeah.
Here are the specific contours of what holiness would look like in our context.
Yeah, and it struck me in rereading the piece in anticipation of our conversation today, Larry, that you start off you're talking about the conciliar project. You talk about the challenges posed to the church by modernity, and in a world, as you sort of say, in its pluralistic register or pluralistic idiom, and you say that the cogency of its diagnosis and prescription was lacking. And I wonder if you could just spend, I don't know, maybe a couple, 2, 3, 5 minutes just sort of talking about this idea of the cogency, or perhaps the lack of cogency of a diagnosis and a prescription.
Okay, we'll start with the diagnosis. What I say in the blog is that I think the council was guilty of a double naivete.
Yeah.
It was naive about the relative strength of the internal faith of the church, believing, I think, wrongly that the church had this deep reservoir of faith just ready to be unleashed unto the world, and it had a naivete about, and this is, I think, more specific to the topic at hand. It had a real naivete, I think, about modern culture and its toxicity towards the faith. And, you can label modern culture however you want. I like the, bourgeois modernity, the culture of well-being, consumerism, political liberalism, whatever you want to call it. The fact remains is that the council, I don't think, understood how deeply those toxic elements of modern culture had already seeped into the church, sapping its strength, robbing its strength, and therefore to sort of throw open the windows and say, okay, kids, now go out and play, was, in a sense, a green light for people who were already infected with that bad sense of liberalism to go out and play in that sandbox. And the results were catastrophic because the council says, hey, we need to read the signs of the times, but it didn't read the signs of the times itself. It didn't look out at that culture and say, there are dangers here that we need to be more aware of with regard to how we expect lay people to go out in the world and live this faith.
It's funny to me. My own background, Larry, is in, I have a master's degree in English. And so I spent a great deal of time, in the academy and reading modernist and postmodernist. And of course, modernism and postmodernism mean slightly different things in English departments and philosophy departments than they do in theology departments. And so I think for me, my own sense of it, I lacked a sharp analysis of things because of that. Like I sort of misread theology, I think, because I was already deep in the throes or the battles of postmodernity and post-structuralism and deconstructionism and Foucault and Derrida, etc. But what is so interesting to me as I think about this now, here's the church in, the mid-60s, early 60s and into the mid-60s with the council. And certainly by 68, the church alters the liturgy in such a significant and I think also a naive way. Yeah. And, 1968, for those people who are not churchy people, right? If those people who are part of the public cathedral, as some commentators have called it, 68 is such a momentous year, a sort of a famously dark year, almost the way that people think of 1848 or
2020.
Right. Yeah. Well, and maybe 2020. Yeah. I'm shocked now as I hear you lay this out of the optimistic naivete that is going on at the very same time in which you have the architects of social destruction flowering in the other parts of the academy. So the naivete really is striking to me.
It's very striking. I mean, as Karl Barth said, the church threw open her windows expecting fresh air to come in, and instead a hurricane blew in.
I love that image, yeah. I mean, I don't love the image, but I love the image.
Yeah. And what he meant by that was, I think, something similar to what I'm saying here. That, I mean, you notice when there's a hurricane outside normally.
Well, I'm from Louisiana, so yeah, I very much notice it.
I'm from Nebraska, so let's say a tornado is going by.
Yeah.
Well, you do open your windows for a tornado. But you get my point. Yeah. So, and there were many, many Catholic intellectuals who were, in fact, sounding the alarm even before the council. There is something deeply wrong here. we are not really engaging the modern world properly. We're either retrenched in this massive defensive posture of scholastic syllogisms and denunciations, or we're in the opposite extreme of simply embracing this mess in very, very superficial ways. This dynamic, what a lot of people don't understand is this dynamic was already going on before the council.
That's right.
After the council, I mean, when I say that the council fathers were naive, I'm saying that's the majority of them. But there was a significant cadre of council fathers who were well aware of what was going on, and they either opposed it, like the right wingers, or they fully embraced it, like the late Hans Kuhn, fully embraced all this stuff. And they had the media on their side, which is why their side of that debate won after the council. As Benedict himself noted, there was the real council, and there was the council of the media. And this is what I mean too about naivete. Here in the United States, I mean, I was young. I was born in 1958, so I was young when all of this was going on, but I still sensed it. There was this palpable air being, and it was being fed to Catholics by the mass media, that what was going on at the council was liberalization. That's what modernization meant. That's what reform meant. Catholics are now going to become like the rest of us.
And so practically speaking, like, again, I'm always fascinated. I'm not a theologian. I'm an English teacher, but, I'm always fascinated with the way, we can argue about the thing that's delivered in its inception, in its conception, in its intent, but then you can really, I think, get lost in that. And perhaps a more fruitful or an additionally important thing for us to consider is what is received. I'm fascinated by this. That's why I'm interested in this Ratzinger's sort of, there's the council that took place, in the hall, so to speak, and then there's the council that took place in the media. What was received, and practically speaking, what did that mean for, a Joe and Jane Catholic in 1964, let's say, and they were reading about the council in the United States media?
What they were reading and what was received was that, okay, the council fathers made certain statements, still fairly conservative and fairly orthodox, but they opened these windows, which they really didn't. But that was what was put out there in the media. And so that people really thought, okay, very, very soon we're going to have a married clergy. That's number one. They thought celibacy was going to be tossed out the window, which, by the way, is why so many young priests who were ordained in that era ended up leaving the priesthood. Wow. Because they were being told in the seminaries, oh, don't worry too much about celibacy because the church is going to change all that.
I've heard that same thing before.
Yeah, and so when that didn't happen, they like, oh, wait a minute, I've been told a lie here. And so the lay people too, we're going to have a married clergy. Hey, we might even have women priests. They were told that the church was most likely going to change its teaching on contraception, artificial contraception. They were told that. They were told, and it actually did come true, that the liturgy was going to be, greatly revamped and changed and so on. And they were also told that in more nebulous ways, asceticism is out. Right. The religion of sin and guilt, that was huge. Guilt is out. It was considered neurotic. It was considered part of that church of shame. What's the phrase? Catholic guilt.
Guilt, yeah.
Which
I didn't grow up with at all because
I grew up the opposite.
Yeah, same. It's always funny when I hear these older people, and I have to take them at their word. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I didn't grow up with Catholic guilt. I have no idea. I mean, I had to. Yeah. I was the one who sort of brought myself back to confession when I was 20 years old because it seemed to me that was what I was supposed to do. Nobody got on my case about this.
Oh yeah, I mean, you had the situation then in the 60s, right after the council, of priests ripping their confession boxes out and replacing them with these god-awful reconciliation rooms, complete, as I say in the blog, with fake plants and lava lamps and music.
You still see them from time to time.
Oh, you do still see them.
Totally creepy.
Or this is worse, priests that eliminated standard times for confessional and would just print in the bulletin confessions by appointment.
I mean, amen. I complain about this all the time. I mean, if we actually believed in what we say the Eucharist is, I simply do not understand why we, at best, in modern American suburbia Catholicism, it's Saturday at 4 p.m. Saturday at 4 p.m.
Right.
in order to cleanse myself of mortal sin so that I can prepare myself to receive the body and blood of Christ, my Savior. Okay. Saturday, I mean, can you imagine a less ridiculous time, Larry?
Well, I can't, especially in my hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska, where in the fall on football Saturdays, you're not going to find anybody.
Yeah. I'm from Baton Rouge. I can guarantee you that 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, everybody is at the LSU game or glued to the television watching the LSU game.
But football, as an example, I was saying, the point is that I mean, weekends in our culture are a time for family, recreation, travel, these sorts of things, which is why the most successful time, and we'll get back to the main theme in a second, but the most successful times, at least as far as I can see, and it's true of my ordinariate parish, is the priest is in the confessional a half an hour before every mass.
Exactly. Yeah. I experienced this for the first time when I studied in Rome for a semester. And I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. You walk into one of these ridiculously beautiful places, right? My parish church at that semester was Santa Maria in Trastevere, and
I lived in Trastevere.
Oh yeah, me too. Okay, great. Okay, so wow, we have a lot. Yeah. So Trastevere is just amazing. It was my neighborhood, and there I am, and I'm at church on a Sunday, and I'm looking at a column that's older than Jesus, literally. And 30 minutes before, I see all these lines of people, like just in what I think two confessionals on either side, and there 4, 5, 6 people in each of the waiting to go. And I look at that like, that's amazing. Of course, and I'm sort of putting it all together like that makes perfect sense because you're at mass and you'd like to receive and you'd like to be in a state of grace. Like, why not? Anyways, mind blower. It was a mind blower. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show too. There is still a reservoir of faith in people. If you build it, they will come. Yeah. If it's preached, if it's emphasized, they will come. But I have actually had more than a few priests say to me, the reason why they don't do that is all you get are the scoops.
Of course.
All you get are the same 10 people coming to confession all the time, confessing the same. Well, you know what? I don't find that necessarily as scrupulosity. Many saints have recommended frequent confession, and we all tend to confess the same sins over.
Right.
It's an utterly bogus, I think, excuse just so the priest doesn't have to sit in that box or a room with his lava lamp a half an hour before Mass.
Right. So anyway, getting on this. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's what was received was a new form of Catholicism that wanted to be positive and optimistic and at one with secular modernity, and got rid of all of these medieval trappings and the sin and guilt and confession, and all that sort of stuff.
The hair shirt Catholicism that always loomed large in Sister Lucy's vision of what we don't want. Yes.
Right. And so, and then some concrete things too, like we're going to have contraception and we're going to have married clergy. And so in 68, you brought it up, when Pope Paul VI came out with Humanae Vitae, the encyclical that said, no, we're not changing the teaching on contraception. Mm-hmm. It's still contrary to the moral law. Mm-hmm. That's when you saw, the doo-doo hit the turbines. I don't say fan, these are turbines. Yeah. And I was 10 years old at this time, so I remember, I hope they don't get it, but they're not going to watch this. I remember my parents, my dad's 88, my mom's 85, they're not going to watch. So I can remember my parents absolutely furious with the Pope.
Wow.
Furious. And that's my memory as a child. And so as I grew into my teen years, I was thinking, the contraception thing is really stupid. Nobody pays any attention to it. Mm-hmm. The massive dissent. And what it showed was how corrupted the theological guild had become. Yeah. And it helps to explain why the council was so hijacked so quickly afterwards. I'll speak to the United States. Because they were ready. They were planning. And this is another naivete, I think, on the part of many council fathers. I don't think, since they're not academics, I don't think they understood what was going on in academic Catholic circles, academic Catholic theology. I don't think they understood completely the revolution that these guys and gals were planning. And so,
we'll lay it out real quick. What were they planning?
They were essentially planning a Protestantized Catholic Church.
Okay.
I mean, and this is one of those areas. For example,
Forms in forms in theology, both, or
oh
what do you
yeah,
mean by that?
yeah. I mean, in many ways, for example, the Novus Ordo, the liturgy that we got, was in fact an attempt to create a liturgy that was more conducive to ecumenism with the Protestants. And see, but this is one area where the council was so easily co-opted. If you read the council's documents on ecumenism, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's perfectly orthodox, it's wonderful, I love it. But just the sheer fact that before the council, discussions with Protestants were strictly verboten. You just did not do this. They're just
Well, they weren't they anathematized?
oh yeah,
Right.
anathematized.
That's what I thought.
You don't talk with them; they're just wrong.
Yeah.
So this is one thing, naivete. So as soon as the council starts saying, "Oh, we do need to talk to them," we do need to seek unity and so on, that then gets co-opted by these very radical liberal theologians in places like Western Europe and the United States, who had already been developing theologies that, in a sense, denied apostolic succession and the Catholic concept of holy orders. This is the linchpin here.
Okay.
They wanted to be able to validate Protestant sacraments, Protestant ministry. And in order to do that, what you had to do was deny the Catholic concept of holy orders as a sacramental in persona Christi change to the man who is ordained, to a merely functional concept of ministry, which is why you see language change.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
No longer the priest, he's the presider.
Yeah, yeah.
He's the celebrant. He's the presider. These are sort of functional sorts of statements. Now, of course, there's a sliding scale of radicality here, but the more radical ones, this was their aim, this was their goal, was a kind of Protestantized Catholic Church.
Well, and you can see why they would attack that, right? Because the and I tell this to my students all the time. What is a priest, right? Like, what is a priest? And most of my kids will answer, oh, like he's the person who like preaches. They sort of think of a priest as a preacher, and I think that goes to show you just how much the new liturgy has in fact informed an entire worldview in which the priest is just the dude in the sort of the robe who preaches, and it really denigrates the central activity of the altar, that the priest is this person consecrated and set aside. And I want to be careful here because I do think that there's an important and robust and necessary critique of clericalism, not the way that necessarily the Pope talks about it, but just in terms of clericalism. I agree that there's a culture of sort of precious clericalism, but I'm just trying to isolate and for the purposes of our audience, just talking about what the priest does. Well, the priest, you and I can do almost everything, but what we can't do is we cannot consecrate the Eucharist. Like that is the work of the altar that I think sets us aside. I can teach, I can preach, I can do these other things, but that is the central function. And I wonder if that's not why it got the attention in these sort of radicalizers.
Well, it did. I mean, along with the denigration of holy orders as a sacrament was the denigration of transubstantiation and the real presence of Christ.
Right.
That's why tabernacles were removed utterly from churches. A more Lutheran notion was adopted that, Christ is really there. I mean, Lutherans do believe in some version of the real presence. Christ is really there, but when the Mass is over, he's in you now. So, ita missa est, go forth, because Christ is now in you. He's not in a tabernacle, and he's no longer on the altar. And so there was...
In fact, people will say that we have fetishized the Eucharist, right? Which is really pretty. It grates on me, I must admit, but it's really kind of disgusting.
It is disgusting, especially since I think Eucharistic adoration, Catholic style, is one of the great gems of our faith.
Yeah.
So many conversions have happened because of Eucharistic adoration. It is unbelievably moving when done right. I mean, no less a figure than Thomas Merton, essentially, came back to the faith because of his experiences in Eucharistic adoration and so on. But to go back to this thing you were mentioning about clericalism, there was a clericalism in the old church, but I don't think the liturgy had anything to do with it.
Right.
And there it was actually, we just replaced one clericalism with
That's
another.
right. That's exactly right.
The Novus Ordo is actually more clericalistic.
So high-handed. So high-handed. Absolutely.
Yeah, because now the cult of personality is
That's right.
around the
Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me.
And I'm not here rad-tratting and saying that we
No,
need
I know.
but the Novus Ordo has defects.
Mm-hmm.
And precisely one of them is the turning of the priest around to face the people. When you combine that with Mass in the vernacular, which I support, you end up with a priest as a kind of entertainer almost. Yeah. And it's all on his personality. Then you get priests who then innovate, change the words of the liturgy. I once said to a priest who was changing the words of the Eucharist, as I was leaving church that day, it was in a visiting parish, so I didn't care what he thought of me. And I introduced myself as a theologian and a visitor, and he was a nice man.
Did you get the eye roll when you said that?
No.
Oh, good.
I don't know where I taught. Like I said, he was a middle-aged guy. He was actually very fetching, very charming, very nice man. And in many ways, I'm sure he's probably a fine priest. But I said to him, he said, well, how did you like the service? I said, well, actually, the music was pretty decent. You have a nice choir. A lot of places don't have choirs. I said, but quite frankly, Father, I found your liturgy very clericalistic. And he said, what do you mean clericalistic? I said, well, you changed so many words in the Eucharistic prayer. I said, by what right do you change the church's prayer that I, as a layperson, have a right to? By what right do you do that? You're a priest, so you can. I said, and that's clericalism. And I said, that is the height of clericalism. Yeah. And to his credit, he said, I never thought of it that way. Yeah. I always thought I was just making the Mass more relevant for more people. I said, not really.
Yeah, I agree. My friends who have been in seminary, both successfully and unsuccessfully, I'm always amazed by the stories that they tell me about that experience. And I'm not going to get into sort of the salacious stuff. I'm just talking about their actual instruction. And I have an incredible amount of sympathy for these men who have gone through the malformation of the modern seminary, because they're taught this.
This is what that's why I was a nice guy.
Yeah, and this, none of this really made sense to me until I think I was in my 20s or maybe in my 30s, and I was same thing. I was visiting a parish, and I happened to show up on a day in which this young-ish priest, he was probably 30, 35 maybe. He was the young associate who had received his reassignment. I think he was becoming a pastor. And so this was his farewell weekend. And it was like the prime spot, like the 10:30 Mass, something like this. And I'm not kidding. He brought out a guitar at some point, and he sang a song to us, and he starts tearing up. The whole thing. And Lord, Larry, as my witness, I wish I was making this up. I wish I was trying to find one of these stories that sort of paints the Novus Ordo in its sort of worst light. But it was in that moment where I'm like, oh, he really thinks this is about him. And then you have that weird moment. I'm angry because it's not about him. But I'm also, this is probably what he was taught.
Yeah, it was. I was in the seminary from 1978 to 1985. So really in the early years of John Paul's
prime time, baby. Prime time.
And I went to a relatively conservative seminary, Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to even to a minor seminary in northern Kentucky that was very conservative. And yet even we had all of those elements, even, guitar masses and drums and all that sort of thing. And we had our loosey-goosey teachers. So even the best seminaries were like this. The worst ones, which was most of them, right, were just nutso on steroids. Yeah. Everything was just up for grabs.
So this points to the naivete that you're talking about, right?
What's that?
This points to the naivete that you're part of the double naivete that you're talking about, and part of the I've been my little notes in the margin, the sort of easy bougie liberalism that the church actually existed in was completely ignored. And it seems to me, Larry, that this is the great temptation.
Oh, it is.
Right. We can limit this to American Catholicism. That's fine. We don't have to speak for the whole bit. But, you say in the piece, and I'm going to quote you here, so sorry you have to listen to your words. It is yeah. As every writer would say, yeah, please go ahead, read more. It is deeply ironic that a council that billed itself as a pastoral council was so singularly obtuse with regard to the pastoral health of the church at that time. It famously asked Catholics to read the signs of the times, but then failed to do so itself in large measure. It failed to notice the extent to which the very bourgeois liberalism it sought to challenge through a co-optation of its categories and their transformation into Catholic ones had already seeped into every corner of the church, dulling its eschatological edge, muting its supernatural call to conversion, and turning everything in the lived existence of most Catholics into a suburban rice cakes devoid of the flavor of the gospel. The culture of bourgeois well-being had become the religion of most Catholics in their day-to-day lived existence, with a deep bifurcation between the daily life in the world and a merely forensic, pietistical, and superficial faith life. It was the religion of Western-style affluence, but with Friday fish fries and the Sunday obligation. I must say that I did a little bit of a cartwheel when I read that paragraph, because I think that really nails it. And what's fascinating to me about this, Larry, is this was in 1967, let's call it.
Yeah.
Look at right now. This is the world before social media. This is the world before the internet. This is the world before Instagram. This is the world before influencers. I mean, it's remarkable.
Yeah, everything. I mean, in a sense, none of this stuff has gone away, which is why it's still relevant to talk about.
Correct.
In many ways, the papacy of Pope Francis, though it has its strengths, its great weakness is that it has opened up these wounds again, because he has re-empowered that faction of the church in ways I'm not certain that he completely understands, as I noted in the part one of this series.
Yeah. Well, and your claim, of course, there, not to rehash this, but personnel is policy, and it seems to us that the people that he has elected to surround himself and empower would be hell bent on this sort of going all in here, right?
Well, yeah, because when you're theologically educated and also have existed within the clerical culture and theological culture of the church for 40 years, 45 years as now I have, you have an ability, and it's not just me, a lot of people, you have an ability to read between the lines. Yeah. You have an ability to assess what the theological project of someone like a Supich or a Tobin really is. And a lot of it is in what they don't say rather than what they do say. All right. So like when the CDF document came out about you can't bless a same-sex union, yeah. Supich comes out with this very bland statement saying, well, some people are going to be rightly hurt by this. See what I mean about reading between the lines? What do you mean rightly hurt by this, Cardinal? That's just code for we should be blessing same-sex unions. Right. I mean, why don't you just say that? Why don't you have some courage?
So why doesn't he? Honestly, why doesn't he? What's the game? What's the game?
And then later on in his letter, he says, so now we just have to find even more creative ways to reach out to our LGBTQIA plus, brothers and sisters in the faith. Which again, if you have an ability to read between the lines, it's one very, very passive-aggressive way of giving the middle finger to the CDF and a green light to every priest in his diocese that wants to continue doing this sub rosa. I have a new blog post coming out called The Failure of Sub Rosa Catholicism. That's probably going to be
what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is that the church has turned a blind eye, and this is part of the naivete. Well, maybe not naivete. That's
what I was good. I was going to ask you, is it naivete?
Well, my friend Christopher Altieri, who writes for the Herald, has been very blunt with me, saying it's not a naivete, Chapp. There was a lot. Well, my point is that the majority of the bishops they were not theologically educated. They were at Piazza Navona eating pizza and drinking wine, and then they voted yes and went home.
As one would, right?
I mean, the movers and the shakers were the big, the conservatives and the liberals or whatever, and they duked it out, and the liberals won because of the media. But I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Altieri, naivete, not so much.
Oh, yes, not so much naivete. You find after the council, then you find all these bishops let's stick with the United States. All of these bishops who are secretly sort of in agreement with the liberal Protestantizing agenda, but for reasons perhaps of career advancement or not, or more better motives, simply not wanting to rock the boat and create schisms within the church. They just sort of maintained a certain status quo. But what they did then was they allowed a certain, what I call sub rosa Catholicism, a certain under the table Catholicism.
Yeah.
All right. So if a priest in his particular parish tells every divorced and remarried without annulment Catholic in his parish, oh, come on, you can come up for communion. I've known you for years. Don't worry about these silly rules. You come up and I'll give you communion. Or as now you have same-sex couples presenting themselves in, oh yes, come, I'll give you a blessing. I'll do
it's the wink. It's the wink and the nod, right? It's the wink and the nod.
Or in the confessional, telling a penitent in the confessional, oh, don't worry about that contraception and masturbation stuff. That's all old hat stuff. Just keep doing what you're doing. God knows your soul. God won't judge you.
Yeah.
So what you get then is this compromise with bourgeois liberal culture, where people are sort of left in place, left with their practices and their immoral practices, and it just is allowed to go on. Or you have the example of priests allowing lay people to gather around the altar and consecrate the Eucharist as he was consecrating the Eucharist. Or even to have women, at the Eucharist extending their hand out in a prayer form, in a consecration form. And this went on all over the place in the Catholic Church. And bishops, angry conservative Catholics would write to their bishop and say, are you going to do something about this? And nothing was ever done.
Radio silence.
You could call it a wink and a nod Catholicism. And there's no greater evidence of this than the doo-doo hitting the turbines after the CDF statement.
Yeah.
All of these people come out of the woodwork enraged. And in a certain sense, I can sympathize with them.
I know. I felt the same way. I'm like, well, I could sort of see why they might have thought that they kind of got sold a bill of goods.
Door a long time ago and let the horses run out, galloping around in the pasture, and now all of a sudden some dude comes out and says, get the horses back in. Yeah. And people are, wait a minute. We've been told now by all kinds of people for a very long time that there's nothing wrong with this. All right. And so this is one of the post-conciliar failures. And in defense of the bishops, the problem that confronted them was this. And I agree with this part of it. You don't want to go back to the illiberal forms of authority in the pre-conciliar church. You don't just want to go back to firing professors from universities, creating an index of forbidden books and movies, a heavy-handed, in other words, disciplinarian, authoritarian bishop, exiling dissident priests to be in charge of the cemeteries for the diocese and militaries and so on. Well, that has happened. But usually it happens these days with the more conservative.
Yeah.
Who create a stink. I know one who's now in charge of cemeteries, which is why I use that example. All right. And so you can do things like that, but bishops were reluctant to do so because that just sort of smacked of an old-fashioned disciplinary church. But their default position then was to just let it all go on. They didn't seem to have an alternative of any kind, which would have been a positive pastoral proposal of their own, where they handpicked certain priests to sort of spearhead it and create a renewal within their diocese of a proper liturgical, spiritual, moral, ascetical type to act as an example. I take that, for example, to be the essential modus operandi and project of St. Pope John Paul II. He certainly, as George Weigel says, John Paul was a great prophet and a great priest, but he was a lousy king because he, contrary to popular opinion, he was not a disciplinarian.
Well, especially in light of Kung's recent death. That's always sort of the first bit. As if the sort of a strange way of recasting John Paul II as some sort of rigid authoritarian is funny.
The Kung example is a perfect example of what we're talking about here.
Right.
I mean, the popular media spins this as, basically the Holy Inquisition has now come down on poor Hans Kung. He remained a priest in good standing, He was not silenced. He wasn't told he couldn't publish or preach. He wasn't even told that he couldn't teach theology in a university. He was just told, you cannot teach theology in a pontifical university with a canonical mandate to teach Catholic theology. All right. And that's the only bad thing that happened to him.
Pretty tame. I'll take that punishment, I suppose,
yeah.
you know.
I mean, compare that with the silencing of somebody like Henry de Lubac by Pius XII, where he's told, don't publish, don't speak, shut up.
All right. All right. So anyway, sorry, I want to take us here. You call it this sort of crucial moment, and I think that this opens us up then to really the meat of this. Hopefully, I hope I haven't buried the lead here on the show too much. But you say that you are seeing this standpoint of settlement, right, with this sort of bourgeois liberalism as the gravest threat to the church, and I think I understand what you're getting to, but if you could set that up for us as to why you believe this sort of all the various versions of bourgeois settlement, you know, there are a couple of different flavors as you pointed out. Why do you think that this is the gravest threat to the church? And I guess then what's the solution?
All right. First off, I'll just preface it by saying it's one of the reasons is it's an internal threat to the church and not an external threat. Sometimes external threats, as you saw, for example, in Poland under Soviet domination, external threats can actually strengthen the church.
It kind of help it. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Strengthen the church. But an internal rot within the church, a slow decay from within, is a far more dangerous proposition than some kind of persecution from without. Good. As I said in one blog, I don't remember when, the church definitely has enemies, but I suspect that the ones within her ranks are far more dangerous than the ones outside her ranks.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think
that's the first thing. But the second thing is this. One of the things I use, obviously, bourgeois modernity a lot. It's kind of code for a lot of things, and I probably should be clearer. But when you combine a sort of bourgeois notion that the ultimate end of life is material comfort and well-being, even if you have a notional belief in God, what a consumerist, bourgeois, suburban sort of existence, and I suffer from it. That's why I'm infected with this bacillus. As I like. I'm a leper talking to lepers. That's why I can identify. I see it in myself. All right, how like every Lent, I have all of these great I'm going to give up bourbon. I'm going to give up this. I'm going to go all Orthodox. And within a week, all that stuff's out. And it's not just because I'm a flabby Christian, which I am. It's because I have been enculturated since the time I was an embryo, all right, to this notion of what I call in one blog our birthright to a sort of life of well-being, a life of material comfort. Now, in some sense, that's the human condition, and it's not particular to bourgeois modernity. But as lots of, from Berdayev and others, thinkers, and Bulgakov and some of the Russians have pointed out, that there is a qualitative difference between modern bourgeois life and ancient tendencies towards the same, because bourgeois modernity gets linked up with political liberalism.
Yeah.
And what political liberalism does, and my next blog is actually going to be talking about that, is in a sense privatizes God to the purely subjective sphere. I mean, faith in God or faith in not God is the equivalent of whether I like a Big Mac or a Whopper. De gustibus non disputandum est. There's no accounting for taste. And religion is simply reduced to the realm of taste. You can still go to your churches and all that stuff, but it's very clear religion has to be domesticated. It has to be, because modernity, political liberalism is rooted in a myth of original violence. All right? The myth of that religions are uniquely dangerous to society, which of course is a lie, is a myth. I think we talked about this before.
We did,
William Kavanaugh points this out. So modernity creates a simulacrum, as Kavanaugh says, of the church. Modernity has its own soteriology, its own eschatology, its own ecclesiology, now just all secularized.
And it's so hard, though. It's so hard to sift these things out, right? As you say, it's so seeped into the fabric, into the warp and woof of our frame, how we see, how we live, how we breathe. It's just so difficult to disambiguate.
It is, because what it has the net effect of doing isn't atheism as such. I mean,
I like this. Yeah.
a robust atheism still contains within itself at least an affirmation of the importance of the question. And perhaps methinks that the atheist doth protest too
Mm.
much. All right,
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
the Hound of the Baskervilles sort of notion, God haunted sorts of people, and it's nor is it nihilism, because nihilism doesn't exist really. Nobody's really a nihilist or a nihilist, however you want to pronounce it. Nobody. You cannot live on that island for very long. You can.
Because
It's all theoretical. Nobody can live without meaning in their life. That's why there's no such thing as a relativist either. Nobody can live
right.
without moral
Right.
convictions. Nobody
Yeah.
can live without meaning in their lives. All that
Yeah.
happens is that our moral convictions and the meaning gets sort of tribalized.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm about to teach Turgenev's Fathers and Sons starting on Monday, actually, and even Turgenev has to kill off Bazarov, or Bazarov really kind of kills himself because he realizes he can't live a life without meaning, without love, without attachment, without other people. It's
so
fascinating.
exactly. I love that. I'd
Yeah,
love to hear you talk about that actually, and lecture on that. That's great.
yeah,
Uh, but therefore, nihilism, relativism, atheism, these are not the right words to describe what it is I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is, in a sense, the unreality of God to most
okay,
people. In other words,
okay.
the sociologist Peter Berger refers to what he calls that societies create for us our plausibility structures.
I like that.
Our plausibility
Yeah,
structures are
yeah,
culturally created. That, in other words, what to us is the really real? What
yep.
to us seems plausibly true on a day-to-day, concrete, existential, phenomenological level? How do I treat truth, and what do I think is really real? And my claim, and a claim of many others, is the net effect of the combining of bourgeois modernity with political liberalism is the change in our plausibility structures.
That's great. Yeah,
So
it's
that even
fantastic.
if we do continue to notionally believe in God, we don't really have a sense of the reality of God.
Okay, and so this is exactly what happens in this moment a couple of weeks ago when Jordan Peterson is talking to Jonathan Pajot, and
Saw that.
he sees that Jesus is the Christ, is the archetype made flesh, and he's like two things he immediately jumps to, which are totally accurate and totally condemning to all of us who call ourselves Christians, right? Is it doesn't seem like Christians really believe this, and it's almost too terrifying to believe this.
Yes, and I mean, and Jordan Peterson was all emotional and
Yeah. Oh,
teary,
it's amazing. Amazing.
because here is a man on the brink of belief, but has really never been quite able to bring himself to it, who
Hmm.
is now suddenly getting, because of his various health problems that he's
Yeah.
had, that has led to
Yeah.
addictions and psychological bouts of depression. This
Right.
is a man who has been in extremis.
Yeah.
And when you are in despair in an extreme, you are now very open to a
Yeah.
different plausibility
That's
structure.
right. I love that. That's
You
great.
now
Mm.
see that the plausibility structures that have sustained you through your culture are false. They are
Yeah.
lies. They are illusions. And then the truth of the gospel smacks him in the face, and it is like it's visceral. You can see it. It's just punched him in the gut. And I
Mm.
wish more people would watch that interview to get a sense of the power that Christ and the gospel and the church could still have in
Yeah.
people's lives if we exploded that dynamite, which then gets me to my remedy to all of this,
Good.
which is not holy card laced doily in the parlor room piety. All right, superficial. I have nothing against rosaries and
Of
novenas,
course. Yeah.
and old ladies in their pews with their loose false teeth chattering away with their their
That's
prayers. That
funny.
happened to me
That's
last
funny.
night. That's why it's on my brain.
Yeah.
Just click, click, click. Well, you know, I should be so holy, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, but that doesn't really move the needle of the Jordan Petersons of the
Right.
world, because it all still, those things, though valuable for us, are very idiosyncratically Catholic. Very,
Yes.
and there's nothing wrong with things that are idiosyncratically Catholic. Every religion has to have those sorts of
Yeah. As
things.
they would say, it's very on brand.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
There you
Yeah.
go. I
Yeah.
like. It's very on brand. But, so, in some ways, though, and this was part of the project of the council that I agree with, although I don't think they were radical enough with it, we have to, as some sociologists and theologians, we have to repristinate the faith. In
Oh.
a sense, it's like restoring a Da Vinci painting by getting some of the varnish and smoke and all that dust off of it. And all of us, like when they restored the Sistine Chapel and the vibrancy of the colors leaped out at you for the first time in centuries. And you're like, oh my God, look at that.
Oh, that's right.
And I take this to, I know a lot of people are down on him. This is part of, I think, Bishop Barron's project, too, with regard to many of his videos and word on. He's, in a sense, trying to do a bypass around sort of what I call novena Catholicism. Once again, I'm all in favor of novenas, the sort of brand Catholicism, and an attempt to sort of repristinate the faith by making it seem once again fresh, new, beautiful. I'm not certain he always succeeds at that, but I think that's the goal. And that should be the goal of every theology teacher. We have to, and priests, we need to flip the script, as I like to say over and over again. We have to flip the script. We have to give people a different set of plausibility structures. And holiness, I think the saints and holiness is the path to do that. Not, like I said, through superficial pieties, but through powerfully converted lives that are in full view for all to see. Not a spectacle, not ostentatiousness, but people whose the power of their witness, like Jordan Peterson, is just there for all to see. Because what we're searching for in reality is a new form of reason, a new form of rationality. And what I like to say to people is holiness is not an emotion. It's not a superficial piety. Holiness is a form of reason. It's a form of rationality. It carries within itself an internal structure and logic. That's why I like to say too, if God exists and is the most real thing that is, prayer is actually the most rational thing a person can do. Right. Prayer is the most important thing, the most real thing that a person can do. And this is what I'm trying to say. The dynamite that needs to explode in the church is the creation through an emphasis on holiness, on the sense of the realness of these things. Wow. The realness of prayer, the realness of holiness, the realness of conversion, because people need it.
I'm for some reason, Eliot just flew into my head, and into the wasteland, he says, unreal city. Of course, he's riffing on Dante, but he says, unreal city, I had not thought death had undone so many. And I was about to ask you the question, why is holiness at odds with this sort of bougie liberalism, this sort of easygoing Americanism? What exactly about holiness is at odds with bougie liberalism? Is it because holiness takes the real seriously, and therefore that bougie modernism, bougie liberalism misses realism or the real?
Yeah, my problem isn't with material things or material comforts per se. My problem is with a culture that makes those things the end point of our existence. So what holiness does, what prayer does, what the realness, a sense of the realness of God does, is it gives us new eyes. It gives us a deeper spiritual sense. And as soon as that happens, you begin to realize the truth of what Jesus said, and he meant it. You cannot serve both God and mammon.
That's so true.
You cannot serve both. Where your heart is, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Right. And I don't think history has taught us any deeper lesson than the fact that it is all well and good to say that I can have tons of material things as long as I'm internally detached from them. What I would say to such a person, I would say to myself, physician, heal thyself, me, because it takes a really, really, really strong person to be able to do this. I once knew a woman, very, very wealthy woman, who once said to me in conversation, I want to live more like the spirituality of St. Francis of Assisi. And I said to her, so you'll be giving a lot of your things away to the church, the poor, soup kitchens. She goes, maybe a little. That's not what I really mean. I'm just trying to foster a greater internal spirit of detachment from these things. To which I said to her that that's not the spirituality of Francis of Assisi. His spirituality was detachment through divestment and the necessity of divestment in order to have detachment. What you're talking about is maybe the detachment of a King Louis or something, and it's possible. But you have a great
let's not call it that. Yeah.
you have to have a great sanctity to pull that off. And for most of us garden variety sinners like myself, that's why holiness, I think, engenders in within us a certain reappreciation of asceticism and the need for a simplicity of life and the need to hold down on our material possessions and the pursuit of those things. And now,
And
obviously, that's a question of degree. I'm not here.
yeah, but you know, as I'm hearing you say this, all I can say, Larry, is amen, amen. But all I can say is nothing is more countercultural than that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that is nobody thinks like this, right?
Very few. I mean, Dorothy Day thought like this, but I'm not always completely in agreement with her radicalism. I mean, Dorothy Day basically thought that almost every Catholic needed to live lives of real poverty, and I don't think that's applicable to most married people with children and
Yeah.
and the obligations of children and so on. So, I mean, with all due respect to her vision, which I love, obviously, because I run a Catholic worker farm,
That's right.
we have to, as Lumen Gentium says in the Universal Call to Holiness, we have to look at each individual as an individual person with a unique set of circumstances. And this is, therefore, why a priest as your pastor is, a real pastor, a real shepherd, is so very important. We don't want priests that are going to simply bless your lifestyle and say, yep, it's all fine. Keep stuffing those envelopes because that's what's really important.
Yeah.
We want priests that are going to challenge people to actually live humbler, simpler, more ascetical lives. And once again, I can't dictate to people what that means. And the most important thing is simply to begin first through a conversion of your eyes, a conversion of your vision. Because then, after you convert your mind and your vision and your heart, then you will know prudentially how to move forward with these other elements in your life of holy. But take me for example. I'm not throwing myself up as an example of holiness, but I'll throw this out here. I mean, I was always academically gifted as a young man, and I had any number of professions that I could have chosen laid out before me where I could have made a ton of money.
Yeah.
All right. And, you pick a profession where you can get a lot of money, and I probably could have pursued that and done it. But that had no appeal to me. None. Zero. And I'm not saying that I'm holy. I'm saying that it is possible for a human being to orient their life around a task other than making money, or even if that's not your primary task, a central fear.
Yeah.
This is more, I think, common among most suburban Catholics. It's not that money is the be-all and end-all of their lives, but it is a fear that governs their life.
And you can see the way that fear becomes a sort of prophylactic layer against grace, right?
Exactly.
And I, when I'm prone and running in that direction in my own head and in my own heart, I certainly feel less close to God, and therefore my holiness, that person with who I'm supposed to be, distances himself from me, right? And therefore you have this sort of this panic of inauthenticity, this flight from the real.
That's a good word, inauthenticity.
Yeah, it really is something I think about, and I look at the responses, right? Because nobody wants to be holy. And I think that's because everybody's scared of it, really. I think, if they're being honest. And so we look at ways in which, because reality's scary. Well, it's another Eliot line. We can't handle too much reality, as he'll say. And if we look at the various responses to the challenges that the church faced in 1965, as in 2021, all of them seem to be evasions of the real. And again, and I'm not throwing rocks here, or if I'm throwing rocks, I recognize I'm throwing rocks from glass houses, so to speak. But they're deflections, right? They're strategies of avoidance as opposed to sort of a jump of faith right off the diving board and into the deep end.
Yeah, that's why asceticism can't just be sort of giving stuff up. All too often, when we interpret asceticism to mean a little less this, a little less that, what you're trying
Yeah.
to do is you're trying to manage your crosses so that your crosses are in a sense, domesticated and tamed. And, oh, yeah, I can do that. And then you can pat yourself on the back because, oh, I gave up bourbon for a week and went.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. No, I mean, to bear a cross is a horrible and bloody thing.
Yeah.
And to do so voluntarily as an ascetical act means you're cutting to the bone. You're doing something that cuts to the bone to create a greater I love that term, a greater authenticity in your awareness of what's truly real.
Right, because if holiness truly is the goal, is the telos, right, is our destiny, which it is, we understand that, right? You know, to know, love, and serve God in this life, so that we can be with Him forever in the next, as the Catechism says correctly. You know, the entering into that reality requires conversion, and we all know, you and I know, everybody I think knows, if you really face it, that work of conversion is painful, because the work of conversion is, you know, it's frictioned, and it's yeah, of course, you know, but right, and so therefore, you know, I understand the various responses that are evasions of it, because nobody likes to be filed down. Nobody likes to have those edges met. We want them to be, you know, we want to, you know, I'm okay, you're okay, as you said in the last show. And we know that is the path to perdition, in his case, literally. And so
you know,
I think that I'll let you finish off here. You can have the last word, but I just want to say one more time that this bomb of holiness, right? This thing, it will unmake all of these structures that we surround ourselves, because they're not real. And I mean, they're obviously they're stuff, right? I mean, I get it, but they're not real in the way that you're talking about the real as the goal of entering into communion with God.
oh, that is so well put. I like the thing you said about, you know, we need to be filed down.
Yeah.
And the church, as a spiritual pedagogy, needs to be that file.
Ah, that's great. Yeah.
And it hasn't been. At least it hasn't been in my life,
No.
and it
Yeah.
hasn't been in
Nor
most
mine. Yeah.
people's lives. And that's what I mean about the church's settlement with a sort of
That's right.
comfortable bougie modernity.
That's
Let's
right.
not be a file anymore. Let's not
That's right.
insist upon a more ascetical, a more disciplined, a life that really cuts to the bone and calls you out into holiness. How can the church be that file when the church
Mm,
herself is so riddled with the corruptions of wealth? I hate to sound
sure.
like a typical sort of atheist critic of the church, but
But
there,
it's a fair critique. It
it is
is. We
a
know that.
fair critique. You know, when we spend so much of our time as a church wondering about monetary things, you know, and the diocese's financial portfolio and its
Of
budget and all
course.
that stuff. I know so many young priests, and you probably do too,
Mhm.
who are now out there in parishes. And I would say a good half of them are absolutely despondent right now.
Of course.
They're
Right. Yeah.
despondent because what they're encountering in parish life is precisely that inauthenticity, that lack of the perception of the real. And when they try to move the needle and be that file, they get resistance from their bishop.
And they get lifted, they get pulled, and
Yeah.
you know, no, it's an exposing thing. It's an exposing thing, and you know, I don't know. This is like a very T.S. Eliot morning. I just keep I have it
Good.
floating around in my head. Who, you know, that, you know, as he, you know, in all of his trajectory, you know, both his sort of pre-conversion stuff and his post-conversion stuff, it's all, I think, of a piece. But I think that those young priests are in their wasteland phase, and I think it's our job to bring us all into the four quartets phase. You know,
That's a
where
great way of putting it.
we go back to the still point, which is the path of conversion, and it's hard, and it's I don't want to be pithy and pat about it. It's difficult, but if the church is not dedicated, it seems to me that if the church is not dedicated in its work and all of its resources toward the work of conversion, toward the telos of holiness, then what the heck is it doing?
I agree completely.
Yeah,
And I think we need to be much more supportive of those priests that are actually trying to do something about this.
yeah,
And they're out there, and there's
yeah.
quite a few of them. And I think lay people need to voice their appreciation for priests like that a lot more. Like one of the things, tiny little thing that I do in this regard is if I'm at a parish and I hear a priest give a sermon that is really good, I let him know that I thought it was really good.
Yeah.
You know,
And hey, and it never hurts to pop the bishop an email.
oh,
Honestly,
I've done that as well.
yeah.
You know, I've done that as well.
All right, well, Larry, awesome. We're right at the hour and hour and 4 mark here. I just want to thank you. This has been fantastic. We need to make this a regular thing. Maybe we could do our Saturday morning chats with Larry and Kale or something like that. So, but at any rate, I will put the links to Larry's 4-part series in the show notes today. It really is fantastic. Honestly, we just scratched the surface on it. I was telling Larry before we went on air, it's so dense and packed. There's so many good things in it. It's worth your time. And Larry, until then, have a great day and God bless everybody. All right, bye now.
Bye. Thank you.